Feed your body with CBD products through Heavy Metal Hemp, now offering award-winning, non-detectable CBD products by Green Roads, producers of the highest quality, pharmacist-formulated CBD products on the market. The same award-winning CBD products found in health food stores, doctor's offices, juice and smoothie bars, wellness centers, and many other retail locations across America. Heavy Metal Hemp, now through September, is offering Skullsessions radio listeners $5 off each 1-pound bag of CBD coffee. All band members receive $15 off each 500 milligram CBD-infused muscle and joint heat relief bottles purchased through September. Feed your body with these and other quality CBD and other hemp products at Heavy Metal Hemp, where you will also find Shockwave's Skullsessions podcasts, music and hemp-related news, and where you can watch for music releases with reviews and more. Heavy Metal Hemp, where you can feed your body and mind. Just click on the Heavy Metal Hemp link on Shockwaves.Skullsessions.com.
You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on ShockwaveSkullSessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
All right, cool. Welcome to another episode on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. And of course, as always, it wouldn't be a Skull Sessions episode without its founder. And of course, I'm talking about the Armenian maven of metal himself, Mr. Bob Nalbandian, who's joining us down from Los Angeles. What's going on, Bob?
Hey, how you doing, Matt? Always fun to do a podcast with you. I'm really looking forward to this one, man.
I am too, man, as well. And I'd like to welcome our very special guest today, who's an underground guitar legend who essentially, you know, as everyone knows, he created the signature New York hardcore guitar sound and style back in the early to mid-1980s with his iconic band, the Cro-Mags, and their underground classic genre-defining debut release, The Age of QUARREL. And, of course, I'm talking about none other than Mr. Parris Mayhew. What's going on, Parris? Thanks again for joining with us today.
After that intro, I guess I could just go home. It said so much.
It says it all right there, right? Well, not really.
You to say.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it, man. And, you know, it's great to be able to talk to the guy who was responsible for writing a large portion of the music on both, not only The Age of QUARREL, but, of course, the crossover thrash behemoth Best Wishes, two total notorious classic records. And speaking of Best Wishes, released 30 years ago this past spring. It's got to feel pretty damn good to know that, hard rock and metal fans from around the globe are still listening to and talking about both of those releases some 30-plus years later. That doesn't happen to many artists, man, and that's got to feel really good, huh?
It's fantastic and strange because I, to a large extent, I'm disconnected from my past in that because, I have a career in the film business and I'm not active in the music world. So this idea that something I did so long ago is not only being discussed, but argued about, oddly enough. And people way after the fact taking credit for things. It's just so bizarre, especially, like somebody said to me recently, "Oh, Parris, I feel like you don't get enough credit for the songs on Age of QUARREL." I said, "Well, do you own a copy of the album?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What does it say on the back?" Mm-hmm. He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "It says all songs by Parris Mayhew and Harley Flanagan." So I would imagine my credit is written in stone.
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's interesting though, because I have seen many things online where it says that Harley was the sole songwriter of that album.
That's because Harley is an expert at public relations, and he knows that he doesn't even have to be careful with his lies. He can just say anything, and if he says it often enough, people will believe it. I mean, even your knee-jerk reaction to my comment was, "Oh, yeah, I saw that he was the sole writer." But if he was the sole writer, why would it say my name first on the back of the actual album?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I know better. I mean, I have the actual album, but I'm just thinking it's just the internet or
No, it's not the internet. It's Harley.
Yeah, okay.
Harley is on a mission because now he wants to take the reins, and he has to, or at least in his own mind, he feels like he has to erase my contributions because he can't go around saying, "I am the Cro-Mags," if a significant amount of the music was written by somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and that's the thing is, as Bob was mentioning, a lot of it's just because of I guess Harley and John, mostly they're the ones in the public eye, obviously doing a lot of interviews. And like, for instance, like you said, you're pretty far removed from your past. You've got a whole other career for yourself, so you're not necessarily out there doing a lot of interviews and stuff, which is why we really appreciate you coming on and really giving your side of this. I of course don't want this to be all just about this. I definitely want to talk about your musical creation, because you do have a great career as a guitarist. You're, like I said, very influential. You created that classic New York hardcore sound. Like you said, you're removed from your past in terms of the CroMags. And those two are still out there just doing interviews. And, of course, it all becomes, therefore, John versus Harley, whereas, the one who gets forgotten all about this is you. You're the guy who wrote the songs with Harley on both those classic records. And, yeah.
And John's lazy lies are even the most bizarre. Him saying that he started the band. He wasn't even our first singer. We played gigs with our first singer, and our first singer, Eric Casanova, by the way, he wrote the lyrics to Hard Times, Survival of the Streets, Street Justice, Life of My Own, which if you just take those songs right there, that's really the CroMags manifesto. That's everything that everybody thinks the CroMags stand for.
Sure.
And it was written by somebody else. So, besides the fact that John was the second singer of the band, and he wasn't an original member, and he didn't write a large portion of Age of Quarrel. His justification for going out and playing the album for the past 20 years is kind of strange. It's again lazy, and it's also a conspiracy of silence, because there was tons of people around at the time, and band members. All the guys in Murphy's Law, Agnostic Front, all those bands were there. We're friends. We're present when Eric played those gigs. And they just stand by silently while John says that he was the original singer and he wrote all that stuff. And I just don't. I mean, I know that they probably just don't want to get involved in it, but they are, unwittingly participating with their silence. Mm-hmm. And it's just strange to me. And I also don't understand it, because John's contribution to me, in my eyes, was significant. He wrote some great songs, and he wrote some great songs with me, like Malfunction is a song that me and him wrote together. Mm-hmm. And I'm super proud of it, and I'm super proud of what he did. And I would never diminish his contribution in that kind of way. But I don't understand why he takes credit for the songs that Eric wrote. It's just so bizarre to me. I couldn't imagine wanting to do that. Mm-hmm. But it's, it all goes down to motivation. It's like, even though he is capable of creating something that is something to be proud of, I think his end goal is something that's completely different than me. Like, I don't think he creates stuff for the joy or the art of it. He does it in some way to kind of elevate himself and give himself a platform. And that's a different kind of motivation that I don't understand. So I can't really speculate on why he does it. But, both him and Harley wrote these books with these imaginary histories to prop themselves up in a position that not only elevates themselves personally and only themselves, but diminishes the other people around us. And it's just something I don't understand. Because I certainly was planning to start a band when the CroMags happened. I tried playing with a couple other people. I was in the Mad for a minute, but they wouldn't let me write songs. So I was like, I need to be in a band where I can play the songs that I've written. And when I met Harley, he immediately was like, I love all of this music. And, one of the songs that I had at that time was World Peace. And he immediately wrote lyrics to it. And that was the first CroMags song. And that was, like, to me, the quintessential teamwork, collaboration. I wrote the music, he wrote the lyrics. It was the first CroMags song, and it really set the tone for everything afterwards. And I don't understand what's wrong with that, because that's the way it happened. And Harley has now created this entire fiction about how, like, he was demoing songs before the CroMags happened, and he has this thing that he released, with the song Down But Not Out on it, which he did record that, but he recorded that during the time that we were writing songs for the CroMags. This was not something that predated, or these weren't songs that, like, he had come up with this concept with it for a band and he had demoed these songs, and then I came along and learned those songs. It wasn't like that at all. He actually was 100% against playing any of those songs, because he said they were for his solo album. It's like, that's a completely different thing. That's my solo album. It was going to be like this 7-inch called, it was going to be a 10-inch called 10 Inches of Harley. Mm-hmm. And but it didn't come out because the manager of the Stimulators who recorded it, it was one of those things where, like, me and Harley were writing songs, and this manager who was the manager of the Stimulators, his previous band, got this idea that he wanted to make Harley into like a star, a solo artist. So he set up a recording session. He put Harley in the studio, and they recorded this thing. And then he basically held the tapes hijack, waiting for Harley to sign a management deal with him, and Harley wouldn't sign it. So that those tapes got shelved. Mm-hmm. And they weren't, and we didn't suddenly go, oh, well, since that's not coming out, we'll play these songs. We literally wrote for like 2 or 3 more years. And it wasn't until we had a singer and a drummer and were playing songs, and we realized, shit, all of our songs are a minute long. We really need more songs to even just play a gig. So I said, why don't we play one of those? Don't Tread on Me is a great song. Let's play that one. So we added it to the set. This wasn't like some grand plan architect, that he says with the demo. That was just another thing he recorded on the side. I mean, I certainly had the song World Peace before I met Harley. So if I demoed that song, is that like part of some master plan that didn't take Harley into consideration? It just doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. Even though I wrote that song, and I wrote a bunch of the songs that are on Age of Quarrel, they wouldn't have been those songs without Harley and John and Mackie and Doug. Everything that changes when you add an element to a chemistry set.
Sure.
I mean, I certainly would have started a band if I hadn't met any of them. Mm-hmm. And it would have been, similar-ish. All those songs would have been there, but there would have been a different lyricist writing different lyrics, and it would have had a different tone. And that's part of collaboration. That's part of what a band is. And I just don't understand, looking back, why we all can't be proud of it and be proud of what we all did together instead of, bickering over fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's been a lot of that.
I got that out now. I can breathe.
Well, yeah. What we'll do is let's talk about your, obviously your musical childhood and upbringing. I mean, from my understanding, your father, he was a country western music producer, correct? So it's safe to assume that really, music obviously was a major part of your upbringing, and not just really the music itself, but also the business side of it as well. What were you able to pick up like along the ways as a child, with your dad being in the business in that scene?
Well, there's so much. I mean, I would have like breakfast with Grandpa Jones and Minnie Pearl, or Johnny Paycheck would be sitting on the couch, and I would fight with him over the remote control, the television. My dad's best friend was Cowboy Jack Clement, who produced all the Johnny Cash stuff. I Walk the Line and all that kind of stuff. So, and my father was, even before country music, he was what he called himself a music man. He just knew he wanted to be in the music business, and he was one of the people who really kind of organized what ended up becoming country music. Because before that, they used to call it like backyard music or porch music, like when all these, soldiers came back from war and they would just sit on their back porches. And then my father and a bunch of other people got together and they organized these jamborees, they used to call them. And a lot of people that came out of those jamborees was like Patsy Cline and Roy Clark. And suddenly there was a little structure to this kind of a folk kind of music. And my father helped mold that together. And because he made those relationships like with Jimmy Dean and Clement, and my father was the first person to record Patsy Cline. He just couldn't get her signed.
Oh, wow.
Because she was such a mess, or at least that's the story I hear. And my father owned record stores, and he was a publisher. He owned Charlie Parker Music before the country music thing happened. He was like involved in jazz in New York. That's where he met my wife. My mom, who was a rockette, and he saw her dancing at the International and at the Copacabana, and he set up a fake audition, so he could meet her.
Oh, really?
And right away. Oh, cool. And then they moved to Nashville with Johnny Paycheck. My father found Johnny Paycheck under a bridge, living in a box.
Wow.
Literally living in a box with this guy. This guy was trying to pitch songs to my dad. And my father heard this tape that Paycheck was singing on. At that time, he was Donnie Young. And this guy's like, hey, buy this song. It's going to be a hit. And my dad was like, I'm not really interested in the song, but who's the singer? The guy was like, no, don't worry about the singer. It's the song I'm trying to sell. This would be a hit with anybody. My dad said, well, I'll buy the song if you take me to The Voice. And they got in the car and they drove over to this bridge in East Nashville. And there was Paycheck under the bridge. And my dad took him and put him in the back of his car and drove him to New York. And within a couple of weeks, he cut his first hit record as Johnny Paycheck, called A11. And that really was what got my dad into the country music business. With Paycheck as partners, they formed a label called Little Darlin'. So yeah, that stuff was always around. My father produced jazz records. He produced a Charlie Parker record, and that kind of thing. There was always music around. There was always instruments around. There were always great players around. It definitely had an effect. My father was the one who released the original CroMags demo tape.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Okay. That it has a Nashville address on it. And because he published the music on that record, when the deal went bad with Profile, our copyrights and publishing predated the Profile stuff. So I still own the publishing for those songs.
Oh, wow.
For you.
Awesome. Yeah, it is awesome.
Thanks to my dad.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And I just want to ask you, too, a little bit about, obviously your introduction to the New York City club scene, as a teenager. I know over the years, when it comes to the media, I mean, CBGB's, has become synonymous with New York hardcore and their legendary, Sunday hardcore matinees. A7, that was another legendary spot down in the East Village and one of the first homes for the New York hardcore scene. But most who were there physically from the beginning of the initial New York hardcore punk movement, which included bands, as you mentioned before, like the Stimulators, as well as even the Beastie Boys. Many peg Max's Kansas City as really the initial club that gave sort of hardcore and punk its first home. And I mean, what's your take on that? Because I know you get a lot of varying opinions on that over the years from different people. I just want to get your opinion on that.
It's a complicated thing, when you're looking so far back, what's in the foreground is what stands out. And CBGB's had a logo, and everybody talks about it, and everybody talks about Hilly and how important he was to the scene and all that kind of stuff. As far as I was concerned, Hilly didn't participate at all. His wife ran the club. Hilly was always just kind of standing in the back. I always felt like they treated the hardcore scene like second-class citizens, and as a result, you didn't even see them represented in the CBGB's movie at all whatsoever. It's insane. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But, the club scene in New York back then was so big. You would open the Village Voice, which was our local newspaper that had the band listings, and there would be 10 pages of clubs and bands, and you would go to shows every night. I mean, we would wait because the Village Voice came out on Tuesday night at like midnight. We would go to the stands and wait for the truck to drop it so we would know what we were doing that weekend, whether the Bad Brains or the Mad or the Stimulators or Crowd or any of these bands were playing. And they played all the time. I mean, I used to see the Bad Brains at least once every 2 weeks. And all these bands. And it was not just it wasn't like that it was all rooted in CBGBs or anything like that. Max's Kansas City was certainly the first place I ever went to see a hardcore show. I saw the Stimulators and the Bad Brains there. And it was like a biker bar for the Hells Angels. It was, pretty intimidating for a 14-year-old to walk up to the front of that, see a line of Hells Angels and be like, I don't know if I should go in there. Mm-hmm. But I saw this girl I knew from high school, this girl, Gabby, and I was kind of standing halfway down the block, and she walked up and she was like, hey, I know you from school. You go to art and design, right? And I go, yeah. And she's like, hey, come and hang out with my friends. And she introduced me to Nick Martin from the Stimulators. And they were, they took me up into the club. And that was the first time I ever went. And Gabby went on to become the guitarist and vocalist for Luscious Jackson.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's amazing how many people. It's almost like if you said, oh, let's take all these famous people and imagine what they were like when they were kids. Holy shit, how can they all know each other? Mm-hmm. There were so many people in that hardcore scene. The Beastie Boys, Gabby from Luscious Jackson was just a girl I went to high school with. And she, one day I look up and she's a pop star. And the Beastie Boys, they were just one of the early hardcore bands. And the next thing you know, they're a cultural phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the rest of us may not have had that kind of significant popularity, but the impact we had on the people that enjoy this kind of music, it's just as powerful for them. It's almost fetishistic, because there's a lot less of them, but they feel it and they love it just as much as everybody else. Mm-hmm. But going back to your question, there were so many clubs. They would say, oh, there's a little public theater on 23rd Street. There'd be a show there. Oh, there's a club on the 25th floor of a building in Midtown called Euthanasia. I think that's what it was called. And we'd go there. And, we'd go to Staten Island to the Paramount, or we'd go to Tier 3 or the Mud Club. And it was just so many clubs to focus on CBGBs and A7. The reason A7's focused on was because A7 was ours. It really was. 7 days a week, there were hardcore shows there. Multiple bands. The shows would end at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
You'd go up to the door. There'd be a piece of loose leaf paper in the window, handwritten with all the bands. It'd be like 10 bands. And the last one would go on at 5 in the morning. And there would be kids on the street. When the sun was up, That was our club. And I heard somebody the other day, it was Billy Milano, said, he goes, "Oh, CBGB's, we just rented that place. We had it once a week on Sunday for 5 hours. That wasn't our home. A7 was our home." Mm-hmm. But the thing about the hardcore scene was, it wasn't like you were at home and there was a show and you went to the show and you were together with these people for these couple hours and then you go home. All the people that went to shows back then, we were all friends. So when the show was over, we didn't scatter. We all went someplace else together, whether it was the park or a squat or a rehearsal studio where one of our friends' bands was jamming. Like, it seemed like we were always together. The scene didn't come together at a club. It was always together. And it wasn't until, like, bands started getting heavier like ours, and then you'd see like one heavy metal fan in the audience, and like if he was brave enough to tough it out, "Hey, I'm sorry, I got some squirrels coming in. Hey, you guys, get back." I was hoping it was video so you could see my posse of squirrels.
Oh, wow.
But, there'd be one heavy metal guy who would brave it out, and maybe he'd get knuckled up a little bit. But if he had the balls to stick it out, and he would show up the next week, everybody would be like, "All right, this guy's all right." And then the next week there'd be like 3 more. It was literally breeding. And then the next thing you know, there were so many metalheads at the show because of bands like us and Carnivore and Agnostic Front. Suddenly overnight, you weren't just seeing faces of people you knew. It was like all these new people. And then before you knew it, the faces we didn't recognize outnumbered our friends. And that's when it became, a national cultural phenomenon that was no longer just our backyard and our friends. Mm-hmm. To me, that was great because, our music rode that wave. But to a large extent, that also destroyed our scene. Mm-hmm. At least the scene that was something that was so tight-knit and friendly. Because as soon as everybody had something at stake, as soon as there were record deals and managers and national tours and fame involved, the unity disappeared. Mm-hmm. And people, it's weird to have people, young, poor people that never really thought they'd have anything, and they suddenly found this little phenomenon to belong to, and all of a sudden they're getting attention and they have power. The strangest byproduct of our little scene that I don't think anybody anticipated. And of course, everybody knows power corrupts, and then people started to become separated, and there was, animosity between any success that any band was having. And of course, there's that same animosity and desire for power is what creates this schism between John, Harley, and I, and all these fictional tales of how it all began. But if there's one thing I can say, is it all began great, and it all began fun, and we were on fire, and we were living life to the best we could, and had no idea we could live it that good. And goddamn, it was a great time.
Oh yeah, it's interesting, Parris, hearing this, because I'm from the West Coast. This is Bob talking now, and Matt's filled me in a lot. I mean, he's really into the he obviously he grew up on the East Coast and turned me on to a lot of the newer hardcore bands. But I remember when Cro-Mags and Crumbsuckers and Bad Brains, and I did a fanzine called The Headbanger back in the early '80s from '82. And so I remember all that. I grew up in Orange County in Huntington Beach. So we had a place called the Cuckoo's Nest in Costa Mesa, which was like the punk rock capital of the West Coast, where all the, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, all those bands, Plasmatics, The Germs, you name it, they would all play there. And it was different. You talk about the unity. I'm actually doing. I've done a series called Inside Metal, and we're doing one on the Bay Area scene, and they talk about that unity too, even with the thrash, how it kind of had a little bit of a crossover appeal. In LA and Orange County, at least pre-1986, in the early 80s, punk and metal was so separate. You had your punk shows at the Cuckoo's Nest, and you had, your metal shows at, clubs like the Woodstock or Radio City or, and the Cuckoo's Nest later became the Concert Factory. And then after you had the crossovers, with Fender's Ballroom and the Olympic, but that came a little later. But it's interesting that the New York scene, it seems a hardcore. I remember when the CroMags came out, because I was dealing with all the independent labels back then, when Megaforce started, it all came out of the distributors. Important had Megaforce and Combat Records, and the distributor Dutch East India. They had their Mongol Horde and their other ones. And then I remember this label Profile came out. Rock Hotel and Chris Williamson, and they would always send me the promos. And I remember getting the Cro-Mags going, fuck, the Age of Quarrel album. This is awesome, because I was such a metalhead, and it's like, this is, it's given that crossover. And the only other band I remember was, Suicidal here in LA. And, I became really close with Rocky. And it was funny because back in the early 80s, Rocky, a friend of mine knew Rocky, and he says, yeah, dude, Rocky is like the biggest fan of like Michael Schenker and Uli Roth. And, you've got these Uli Roth Scorpions videos. And next thing I know, Rocky's coming over to my house in like 84 or whatever, watching, Uli Roth videos. I'm thinking, wow, this is crazy. I've never seen that kind of crossover. But in New York, talking to, like the guys in Anthrax and Overkill and all the metal bands, it seemed like it was more of a communal thing with the thrash bands and the punk bands, what created the hardcore bands. You mentioned, bands like Carnivore, Pete Steele's band that eventually became Typo, and of course Bad Brains, early on. It seemed like there wasn't that much of a separation like it was in on the West Coast. Is that accurate to say?
When I started the idea of starting a band, there was no word hardcore.
Right.
And I never identified with punk rock. I mean, in my neighborhood, in the Bronx, if someone called you a punk, that was like a bottle across the face. Mm-hmm. Like, nobody called you a punk. That was like the worst thing you could possibly be called. Mm-hmm. So when this phenomenon of punk rock happened, I never really identified. I never understood. I could never get past the name, even though I loved the Sex Pistols. It changed the way I looked at music, because I was listening to, Rush and Van Halen and Aerosmith like everybody else, and Led Zeppelin, still my favorite band. And but I was listening to, the Dixie Dregs and Pat Metheny and Mahavishnu Orchestra and Scott Henderson and Brand X and all this other stuff. And when I went in to start a band, I was definitely there on the Lower East Side, watching these bands like the Beastie Boys and the Stimulators and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't really think of them as real bands. I know that sounds funny, but like, even going to see when the Bad Brains started to become really powerful, I was there and I was losing my mind, but I couldn't get my head around the idea that they had anything to do with the guys that played at Madison Square Garden. You know what I mean? Like Rush or Van Halen and all that kind of stuff. I guess it was kind of a strange transition when I started to realize that I could enjoy music that wasn't spoon-fed to me by the radio. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's a weird context to think that you could actually discover something on your own. And I had that, I guess they call it cognitive dissonance. I just wasn't willing to accept it initially. But the Sex Pistols and Motorhead were the band that bridged that gap for me, when I realized, first of all, that you didn't have to be Steve Howe from Yes to form a band. You didn't have to be Eddie Van Halen. Because I was digging the songs that Motorhead wrote just as much as I was digging Van Halen and all that kind of stuff. And I realized, holy shit, maybe. And then the Sex Pistols the same way. I was like, I can't play Close to the Edge by Yes, or write it. Maybe I could play it, but I couldn't write it. But I thought I could write something like the Sex Pistols and Motorhead. And that was really the thing that opened the door for me to play heavy music. But I still did not. There was no hardcore. So I was still coming from the Van Halen, Rush, Aerosmith point of view. And when I wrote World Peace, I didn't think I was writing a hardcore song. I thought I was writing a Motorhead song. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to it, it's basically Rush on the left hand and Lemmy on the right hand. Right. Coming up with these chord patterns that that were just like derivative of Rush, not derivative, but like Rush, like if you know the song Bastille Day and Anthem, there was like there was this one thing that goes wham, the band stops and Alex Lifeson by himself goes wham and I was like, oh my god, he's playing one chord, he's just playing it high and low, and I was like, that's amazing. So I was like, what would it sound like if Lemmy was playing that? So I went, and that's Signs of the Times. Wow. It's a Rush song, played completely different, as if Lemmy was playing it.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's what I loved about the CroMags, is because I totally hear that you were a metalhead in your guitar playing, the riffs, the leads, and that's what I appreciate. And that's why I was always a metal guy, and always, all my friends were punks, because like I said, I grew up in Orange County, which was like everyone was punk at my age at that time. And I would take them to early Metallica and Slayer shows, and they would take me to see the Vandals and the Dickies and whatnot. But I like some of the fun bands, but when I saw especially your video for We Gotta Know on MTV, I'm like, holy shit. Because you had never seen, I think maybe Megadeth Wake Up Dead was the only other video that really showed that slam dancing and the stage diving and that total mayhem on, I know it was on Headbangers Ball, but it was even shown during the day sometimes on some of the metal shows. It was like, wow, this is insane, and
worldwide, it was on regular rotation.
Absolutely.
We got into a video.
Yeah, and that just kind of blew me away.
After I edited it, I gave it to the label, and the label head was like on his way to some musical convention in Paris, and he was like kind of brushing me off, because I made the video myself, and I handed it to him. He's like, I'll take it and I'll give it a look while I'm in Paris. And he said that while he was at this seminar, they had a VCR set up, and he just popped the tape in, and he said for the entire weekend of the seminar, there was a crowd watching the video over and over and over and over for the entire. And when he came back, he's like, okay, we're putting this out. Wow. So that was pretty cool. But going to my point about there was no hardcore, or that name was being bandied around in transition over the time we were writing the Age of Quarrel. When we put out Age of Quarrel, again, I thought I don't think of it as a crossover album. I thought of it as a Motorhead album, a rock album that I was trying to put out. So to me, and Seekers of the Truth and Malfunction are on that album. Mm-hmm. So when people always said when we did Best Wishes that they turned metal, I was like, didn't you hear Age of Quarrel?
Right.
Yeah. Malfunction and Seekers of the Truth are on that album.
Yeah. And
to me, it's not about the category, because I don't give a rat's ass about that. To me, it's just the song I wrote that day. Mm-hmm. But if people are gonna get all their panties in a bunch because they think we turned metal or something when we did Best Wishes, they just they don't recognize the fact that those songs are metal songs.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, speaking of Age of Quarrel, like you said, most people, they think of, they don't really necessarily think of that as a crossover record. It's really considered like the Bible of the New York hardcore sound. Yeah, no, which is great. But as you said, both those songs, Seekers of Truth and Malfunction, are total, slower, more 70s sort of Sabbath style songs, like heavy rock songs. And I actually always considered that was like the first crossover record. I mean, obviously, yeah, Best Wishes, there was a little bit more, obviously, solos. There's a little bit more, I would say, metallic riff. And I guess, too, in the late 80s there, I mean, that was sort of where a lot of the music was going. Like, speaking of Best Wishes, when you guys were doing that, was that just a natural progression, getting a little more metal, or was that something, because I know a lot of obviously hardcore bands, a lot of the crossover bands were just kind of going that direction. It just kind of happens naturally because, and you had mentioned, I was reading this book, the Crossover the Edge book, and I was reading the section on the Cro-Mags that you were talking in there, and you said something I've been saying for years about just metal and punk in general, is that there's really not that much difference between the two. And as you mentioned there with metal, it's more maybe the guitarists in metal, maybe taking guitar lessons, are a little bit more seasoned musicians, but both are essentially the same. They're fast, they're aggressive with heavy guitars. And so I always considered, when Best Wishes came out, to me, I mean, that was really the first I actually heard Best Wishes because I'm a little bit younger. I grew up in the New York hardcore scene in the early 90s, and I have actually first heard Best Wishes before I actually even heard Age of Quarrel. So to me, that was always just the quintessential, one of the top quintessential crossover records. But yeah, with Best Wishes, I mean, did you guys was that a conscious decision to kind of get a little heavier, or was it just a natural sort of progression?
I think it has more to do with kind of the concept of natural selection. A species kind of goes in the direction where there's better light, more food, water. And like I said, these metal kids who were showing up to the shows literally over a very short period of time outnumbered the hardcore fans. Mm-hmm. And suddenly our normal fans had become a small faction in the audience. Mm-hmm. And when you're getting responses from something, it's a positive reinforcement. So it certainly had an effect on us personally when we see that our audience has changed and that we're getting responses. Like if we come up with a riff that's more metal and it's moving the audience more, then we certainly went in that direction. So I absolutely feel like the change in the audience, the change in the fans, changed maybe how we geared our music, whether it was unconscious or conscious or what. I mean, I certainly only write music to please myself. Like I sit down with my guitar and I play until something sounds cool. Or in the case of the Cro-Mags, I would play something until I knew it would impress Harley, because he was like really my sounding board. If I played it and his eyes lit up the way they would, and he got that smile and picked up his bass and joined in right away, I know it was good. And that's why I wrote stuff the way I did, just to make it so we would have that moment together where it was just like we felt powerful and we had fun and we were proud of what we were doing. It was a long, long time ago. It's hard to put myself back there, but look, in hindsight, I would say it had to have been like I said, like a natural selection thing.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about that,
and also one more thing I have to add is our skills as musicians were being honed. Because you got to understand, when the Cro-Mags started, Harley was the drummer and I was the bass player. So I wasn't a guitar player by any means. Mm-hmm. But back then there wasn't this huge pool of talent to draw from. Like there weren't like YouTube guitar whizzes, and there weren't guys on the scene that everybody knew about. There was literally nobody. There was on the hardcore scene. There was no positive reinforcement for great musicianship. There was actually no expectation for it. So the scene didn't draw people that could play well. We literally you'd have to find people from outside. Like Mackie, I knew from skateboarding. He used to hang out on the Upper West Side at this, what we'd call the West Side Banks. And on the east side of Manhattan, we had the East End ramps. And everybody was very territorial, and you didn't go into other people's neighborhoods and that kind of thing. But I always went over to the West Side ramps. And I guess they didn't mind just because I was such a crazy skater. But I met Mackie over there. So when he appeared on the hardcore scene in this band Frontline, I was like, I got to steal this guy. I mean, that was my plan from the very beginning. When I first started seeing hardcore shows, I was like, it seemed to me that, it was this spattering of talent. There was like a few good people here, a few good people there. If you could just like grab all those elements and put them together, then it would make a great band. As a 15-year-old thinking I had a master plan, I certainly didn't have a master plan, but that was my plan. And fortunately, I got Harley first, which was great bait for getting other people. So it was Harley. And then when Mackie came along, I was like, hey man, we're doing this thing, listen to the songs. So we brought Mackie in. And then by the time it was time to make the Age of Quarrel, Doug Holland was another powerful force on the scene. And when you watched, Kraut, it was so clear that Kraut was his band. He was the driving musical force. And he was a great guitar player. Is a great guitar player. I don't want to disparage him. I haven't seen him play in a long time. I'm sure he's still great. So poaching him was the next part of the plan, And he came into the band, must have been weeks before we recorded Age of Quarrel, so he really didn't participate in any of the writing. He was great to have in the band. So we literally, like, it wasn't, it almost, and Doug, of course, doesn't come from the hardcore scene either. He's like, he's a rock and roller, loves Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and The Clash and all that kind of stuff. So he came from a school of people who wanted to actually know their instrument. I grew up listening to Rush, and Mackie, his background was definitely not hardcore music. He learned how to play drums properly. So we were anomalous on the scene. So by the time we got to the level where Age of Quarrel was out and we were playing it all the time, we were like really, really good at our instruments, or a lot better than we were before. So by the time we made Best Wishes, just the playing was so much better, so much tighter. and the writing was just more thoughtful.
It's interesting going back to the 80s when Age of Quarrel came out, and the albums you were involved with, and the Cro-Mags in general really stayed true to their sound. So many of the hardcore bands going into the latter 80s and into the 90s, no disrespect to them, but I don't know if they changed their sound to fit more what was going on with the times that was going on in maybe the New York scene or whatever. But you saw Pete Steele, with Carnivore, more for the Typo Negative, a whole completely different sound. Bad Brains went from their hardcore to more of a reggae sound. And then you saw a lot of the hardcore New York street bands like Biohazard going into more of a hip hop sound. Of course, Beastie Boys going to the rap, but Cro-Mags always really kept that hardcore metal sound. Was there once you started getting pretty big and you were on MTV and this and that? Was there pressure from labels for you to morph your sound into something more, so to speak, commercial? Or what do you think attributed to the other bands going that way? And again, no disrespect to the other bands, but the fact that you kept it true and kept it real, you really have to applaud, that.
Nope, nobody from our label ever really spoke to us. The main guy from the label was a homosexual, and John and Harley hated him. And they would not listen to a word he said anyway. If you look at the picture on the back of Age of Quarrel, everybody looks the way they look because he was standing there. You think I'm joking, but I'm not.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was him and and the photographer that he hired, who was also gay. And literally those guys were just mocking them the entire time we were taking the picture.
Wow.
And it was just so there was never any input from the label about anything. And even though Chris Williamson was part of the label, part of the Rock Hotel portion of it, we never listened to anything he said anyway. He would show up to our rehearsals with a metronome and stand there and try to conduct us, and we would all just laugh and look at him. Not that the tool of a metronome is not a valuable tool. I certainly use it today, and maybe back then if we had, it could have been better, but I don't see how Best Wishes or Age of Quarrel could have been any fucking tighter. We played Steve Remote, the engineer, said that me and Doug were almost canceling each other out. All we did was play, so we didn't have to worry about that. But going back to what you were saying, I can definitely speak to the Pete Steele aspect of it because he was a friend of mine. Pete was very easily seduced by music, and he would blow with the wind, man. If he heard something he liked, he would take it and he would live it and embrace it. And I watched him go from the thermonuclear warrior wearing fur and singing about, making love on the fur,
right,
to discovering the hardcore scene and shaving his head and throwing on a pair of combat boots. And literally overnight, he transformed 100% into a hardcore guy. And that's when he was working with Agnostic Front, and he was writing Retaliation. One of the proudest compliments I ever got was when Pete said that he wanted Retaliation to sound a cross between Black Sabbath and the Cro-Mags, because Retaliation is one of my favorite albums of all time.
Yeah, great record.
So he went through that phase where he did the hardcore album Retaliation, or his version or his spin on hardcore and Black Sabbath mixed together. Right. But there's a phenomenon that a lot of people don't know about in artists, that if they do something and people respond, it is a tremendously gratifying thing, and it uplifts you and it moves you forward. But if people don't like it or it doesn't sell, it's a horrible blow for you to sit down for a year, which is usually what it takes to write an album, just cobble together and pan for gold and little bits and pieces and finding them together and finally getting to the point where you can go into a studio and record a cohesive thing and then have people not embrace it is devastating. Mm-hmm. And Retaliation was not well received. Mm-hmm. They were headlining, playing shows at Lemoore in Brooklyn to sold out crowds and people going fucking wild. And I would tell my manager, Chris Williamson, we got to get this band to open up for us in Manhattan. And they would come and they would be our opening act. But if Carnivore played a show in Manhattan, there were crickets. There was 5 people in the audience. It was the most bizarre thing in the world. So, And Pete, had another thing everybody doesn't know is like Louis, the drummer, spectacular drummer, fucking god on the drums. He was a bus driver. He had a union job. He had benefits. And growing up poor or middle class in New York City, having a kind of job like that is very desirable. Mm-hmm. And Pete worked for the Parks Department, the same kind of thing, a union job with benefits and taking care of his family and a future and all that kind of good stuff. And these guys were not going to give that stuff up for something that people weren't embracing. I think by the time Retaliation came out, Pete had already given up. So the next phase was him starting Typo Negative or Retaliation. And the rule for that band was you had to live on his block to be in the band. I mean, that's how. And he wrote all that music. And again, the first Typo Negative album came out, and he had heard industrial music or whatever, and a little bit of goth, and he made that album, which is a spectacular album that nobody bought. And then he discovered the goth thing, right? And then he goes full goth, puts out Bloody Kisses, and it goes platinum. And you know what happened? Pete got locked into that moment. That person who used to embrace and morph stopped because he had gotten the response he finally wanted. And then until the day he died, he was that person that found himself with that album. If Bloody Kisses had failed, Pete could have been 10 other things. And I don't know if that's dishonest. To me, he's just an artist who could morph and do all these spectacular things. People seem to frown on that kind of thing. Oh, he's a hardcore. Oh, he's pretending to be hardcore. He wasn't pretending to be hardcore. He was 100% hardcore for those 2 or 3 years when he wrote Retaliation.
He was an intense dude.
He was fully committed, a great artist. Just knowing him was a pleasure.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, I know you worked with Pete for a little bit, didn't you?
Well, not directly. I started Roadrunner. I ran their LA office in '91 when the first album that you were referring to had just come out, and they were kind of of course, they. I don't know if Roadrunner actually released the Carnivore record. I think they did something with Carnivore, and then the Typo came out, and exactly what you said. People didn't know what to think of the first album. It wasn't until Bloody Kisses, and by that time, I had left and went on to Bizarre Records, but. During that time, I remember it was the oddest thing because they booked Typo Negative a tour with The Exploited, and they played the Hollywood Palladium out here. And I remember I met him there because I got tons of interviews because there were a bunch of people on the West Coast. A lot of MAGA they had an interest that first album and did a lot of interviews, and he was. Really cool guy, and everyone's like saying, "Oh yeah, Pete, he's real dark. He was such a pleasant guy. He seemed, and that was the only time I really hung out with him. So I really didn't get to know him very well, but I did remember, when that first album came out, and it was definitely a tough sell because I think everyone knew of Pete Steele from Carnivore and expected that, but until Bloody Kisses came out, and really broke big. And you did some of their videos, isn't that right? Parris?
I mean, just talking about like how small the scene was and how we were all tied together. The album cover for both the first Carnivore album and the second Carnivore album was done by a guy I sat next to in homeroom in high school. And we all went to hardcore shows together. And then I ended up directing the video for Black Number One. And I wanted to do a video much earlier for the Slow, Deep, and Hard album. And I had actually met with Pete and Josh about it. Because, I knew I could see it's an odd thing to be able to think you can predict these things because I'm like not an A&R guy. I'm not one of these people that can spot talent. I just know what I like. And normally I'd say if I like it, it probably won't be successful. But I'd seen Pete play. I'd go to Josh's house and watch Carnivore rehearse in their basement. And just I remember the first time I saw Carnivore, it was like they had a hardcore matinee at CBGB's. And then at nighttime, they had a metal show, which was like really rolling the dice, like having a hardcore crowd in the afternoon. And then like that transition when the hardcore people leave and the metalheads show up, they were like asking for a rumble. But we had finished playing. We headlined, so we were on last. So we were lingering. And while we were loading out, I was with Sean, who did the album covers for both Carnivore albums. And he was trying to drag me out of the club. And so I grabbed my guitar and I'm starting to walk out. And literally just as we walk out past the stage, Carnivore hits their first chord. And I just stopped dead in my tracks. I could not even understand what I was hearing. I wasn't aware of like down tuning. It wasn't a common thing. This was like, I mean, Black Sabbath did it a little bit, but Carnivore was like a whole step lower than Black Sabbath. And I was looking at their amps and I'm looking at their pedals and their guitars and I'm trying to figure out what's making this sound. I just couldn't believe it. They must have been playing the song World War 3 and 4 because I was like, I just couldn't even believe my ears. And Sean is like pulling on me, like, let's go. And I just stood there and watched them play this song, which must have been 15 minutes long. And when the song ended, I was literally standing there like almost flabbergasted because I had, like I said, in the hardcore scene, there was no musical virtuosity. And I was hearing stuff that I didn't understand. When a musician hears music that I just can't put my finger on how it's being made, that's magic. That's great. I was just, in that moment, I was like totally blown away. And I'm kind of like a little dumbfounded. And all of a sudden I see this giant hand coming into my field of view. And I look up and it was Pete. And he was leaning down over the stage with his hand out. And he's like, my name is Pete. And I was like, hey, man, how you doing? He goes, great set today. I said, thank you very much. And he just like leaned back and they continued doing their sound check. And it was only in that moment that I realized he was wearing a CroMags t-shirt.
Wow.
Nice.
I didn't even notice because I was so blown away.
Wow.
Yeah.
But so my whole thing was like, that was when the first time I saw them and I watched the whole first album come out and Retaliation come out and just be such a spectacular thing. I remember telling everybody about it. And again, like they just fizzled and faded. So when So Deep and Hard came out, I sat down with Pete. Pete came over to my apartment in Brooklyn. I lived right across the street from Keith Alexander, the original guitar player from Carnivore, coincidentally. And me, Pete, and Josh just had this conversation about a video for Slow, Deep, and Hard, and there was just no money to do it, so that never happened. But I always stressed this idea to Pete that I wanted people to see what I saw, and that'll be the key to bridging the gap between him and the rest of the world. Because as unfathomable as it is that Retaliation didn't get any attention, it just didn't. So when the opportunity came to do the video for Black Number One, I was like, right up in their faces. I went up to Roadrunner and I told Doug and Monty and Howie and all those guys, I said, listen, if you do not let me direct this video, you're fucking stupid. Because these guys are impossible to deal with and nobody understands. Nobody's going to show them the way I will show them. Nobody will put up with all the shit. No, you'll hire some regular guy and he'll feel like he's being shit on and he'll surrender and he just won't make a great thing. You need me to make this video. So they agreed. I made the video. I called in every favor I had. We did 2 days for the price of one, which is a big deal in the film business because I got technicians to work for 2 days for the price of one because these guys worked for me a lot. I did a lot of music videos. And I sat down with Josh and Pete and I was totally like open. I said, listen, I want this video to be what you want it to be. Tell me your ideas. And me thinking, I know Pete, he's like, he's a thinker. All he does is fucking think about music and chords and harmonies and shit. But he had he's like, I don't have any idea about what the video should be. He goes, I only know I want it to be funny. And I said, well, Pete, I don't think you're a funny band. He goes, yeah, but we have a lot of humor aspect. I was like, yeah, but I don't see it that way. I see you as dead fucking serious, and I think the world should see you as dead fucking serious. And then I told him how I saw the video with the black and white and the dipping in and out of, and we made the video, and the rest is history. I think everybody saw Pete the way I did.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool. Yeah,
and I was happy to be able to do that. It ended my friendship with him mostly because of the band. They all felt like that I didn't spend enough time directing them, and Pete's in the video more, and we bandied back and forth with arguments about it. Case Vessels, the owner of the label, got involved. All the executives at the label got involved, and they all basically took my side.
Right.
And I didn't want it to be that way. And Pete called me and we had this long conversation. I said, listen, man, I don't want to like pull rank and say they basically told me I could do it any way I want, but give me a list of what you want to do and we'll talk about it. So he gave me a list of like 20 changes, which is like crazy. And it was all changes that the other guys in the band wanted. And I think I made 9 of the 15 changes. I bent over backwards, to do it. but ultimately, me and our friendship ended because Pete was like, these guys in my band, I got to live in I helped Pete get in the tour bus, and now he's telling me, now I got to live with these guys in a tour bus for years, and they want me to take a side, and I can't take your side and then live on the bus with them. So that was basically the end of our friendship.
Yeah. That unfortunately happens so many times in the music business. I've heard. But, it's just a great story.
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah.
But I'm proud of the work I did on the video. I still look at it. I mean, me and my wife were sitting in the house about two years ago, and VH1 was on, and they were playing all these old rock videos. And I looked at the TV, because you never see rock videos, and it was like Viewer's Choice Top 100 Rock Videos, People's Choice, like voted. And we watched it all weekend because they were playing, Stone Temple Pilots and all, just cool rock videos. And then it got to the last 10, and we started paying attention, just out of curiosity. And it got to number 2. And number 2, People's Choice VH1 all-time favorite rock videos was Typo Negative Black, number 1.
That's
and number
awesome.
1, Bon Jovi. Living on a prayer.
Bit of a contrast.
Yeah, pretty good company, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'm not a Bon Jovi fan, but of course you can't help but respect his success.
Sure. Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Yeah, going back just a little bit to earlier, we were talking about Chris Williamson, and he and the Profile Records. Obviously Chris Williamson became sort of the biggest villain of the New York hardcore scene, and in Profile, of course. It was basically a rap hip hop label. I mean, it was the home of Run DMC and Rob Bass, and there was, but I don't think there was any rock artists on their roster at the time when you guys came out with Age of Quarrel. Yeah, and conventional wisdom, I guess, would suggest that they tried probably just expanding their urban music resume by signing, you guys. I know Leeway and Murphy's Law, they also signed, but I think the problem, of course, is they obviously they had no idea how to market or work with the hardcore bands, and even though you guys were having major underground success. And of course, when you add to that, you guys, I heard got, zero tour support. There was extended record release delays. There's poor distribution outside of the home market. It's just a recipe for disaster. And I think, I remember even in, early 90s, Maze Records, that was another, I think, local independent label that signed a few hardcore bands like Sheer Terror and Biohazard. And they went through kind of similar experiences. And I think due to it, just the music and the scene really, hardcore and just, you guys, you never really got as big as it should have been. I really think that there wasn't anybody that knew what to do with the scene because it was like kind of all over the place. Like you said, it was very, it wasn't, like a homogenous sort of scene, it wasn't like a groupthink type of thing. I mean, there was so many different, styles, not just musically, but even, the way people dressed. It didn't have any of that kind of stigma attached to it. And that's what made it really truly underground, and that it never really became mainstream. Even though a lot of people really thought it could have gone, not so much mainstream, but it could have made a dent in music the way sort of like, how grunge did and even thrash did, and they eventually got to, some mainstream success as well. What's your take on that?
There's a couple of things, it's easy to look at it in retrospect, but the truth is oftentimes when you're the first of a kind of band, you basically just break doors open and just never get a chance to step inside because, people turn on each other or the label is so destructive to the morale that it all disappears. We definitely opened up a door and forged our way through touring frontiers that a lot of other bands were just easily stepped into that. And God bless them, I'm glad we did something. But there just wasn't an infrastructure for us. Mm-hmm. Like you said, blaming Chris is just kind of like typical youthful, unwise, oh, fuck you.
Yeah, sure.
Fuck you. It's not Chris was a guy who saw things happening. He was initially a club promoter. He literally took bands like us out of the little clubs and put us, on big stages, advertised them in a bigger way. He tapped into that all those metalheads that were coming to the show, and he instantly, like overnight, for some of us, at least for CroMags, it happened that way. We started headlining shows at the biggest clubs in New York with only like 2 opening acts, and that was totally bizarre. Like, Agnostic Front never stopped having these Super Bowls of hardcore, which were great, for the whole thing. But like Chris tried to contextualize us as a independent rock band that had nothing to do with the scene. Mm-hmm. And he elevated us in a big way. And then he tried to figure out a way to fit us in. And he wasn't getting deals offered for the big label, so he had to make something up. So he went to Profile Records, and he proposed that they give him his own label, Rock Hotel Records, and they wanted us. They wanted the CroMags, and so he got out of it, Rock Hotel Records, and we got out of it being on Profile Records. Now, the guys in the band look at this as like some great betrayal because he benefited from it, because like just like everything else with these guys, for some reason they can't stand it when anybody else benefits. But, Chris was facilitating what we needed. He helped himself, of course. The big problem was we were signed for 5 albums and Chris was only signed for 2 albums or 2 years or something like that. So at some point along the line, he lost any power within the label to help us. When he promised us that he would be the label guy, he would always make it happen. Right. But he did the best he could. That was the deal he could get. And that deal got us to make Age of Quarrel and got us out there. Now, maybe it didn't, that album wasn't like a kill 'em all. It wasn't a launching pad, But the problem was, the real problem with the CroMags, you can point the finger at Chris Williamson and Profile and anybody else. But the real true problem with the CroMags is that we were all on the launch pad. And instead of like embracing each other and being like, yeah, man, we did it. Let's all launch into the stratosphere together. Instead, everybody was trying to push the other person off the launch pad. And that's a goddamn shame. Yeah. But that's exactly how it happened. So, people in retrospect can point fingers at Chris or the label or any of these things, or drugs or any of the things that were obstacles to our success. But it was really us. All we had to do was cooperate. And I said that to Harley 1,000 times. I was like, dude, I'm begging you. I'm just begging you to just see the future. Stop bickering about imaginary shit. Most people, the crazy. If I could just sit here and give you a laundry list of the crazy shit that I've dealt with. But at the very end of the Revenge tour, when we broke up, if I told you why the CroMags broke up, you would not believe me. But I'm going to tell you anyway.
Stay tuned later this week for part 2 of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, featuring original CroMags guitarist Parris Mayhew.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.